Welcome to Bumpy Johnson Uncensored. Today we're diving into one of the most shocking, least talked about moments in 1949, the day Bumpy Johnson marched straight into a hostile white town with 100 men at his back. And what happened next stunned everyone who witnessed it. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and make sure you hit subscribe, because it takes real time, real digging, and real work to uncover verified historical details like this. 1949, America was still boiling under the surface. World War II had ended just a few years earlier, and millions of black soldiers had returned home expecting respect, equality, and basic human rights, yet found themselves facing the same segregation, the same threats, and the same violence they had left behind. Jim Crow laws were still deeply rooted in the South, and even northern towns had unofficial racial boundaries that everyone understood but rarely spoke about. In many communities, one wrong step across the invisible line could get a black man beaten, arrested, or even killed. This was a time when police often looked the other way, and white mobs handled justice their own way. Harlem was tense, the South was tense, and the entire country felt like it could erupt at any moment. Bumpy Johnson, already recognized as a leader in Harlem, understood these tensions better than most. He knew that any act of disrespect or threat toward a black family wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a much bigger national pressure cooker. So, when word reached him that a black woman had been harassed and threatened in a nearby, predominantly white town, he didn't see it as a small problem. He saw it as a spark that could ignite something far bigger. And in 1949, people followed leaders who showed strength, even if that strength meant walking straight into hostile territory. The spark that set everything in motion began with a single, terrifying moment. A young black woman who had recently moved to the edge of a predominantly white town was walking home from work when she was surrounded by a small group of local white men. According to accounts from people who lived in Harlem during those years, the men didn't just harass her, they threatened her, blocked her path, and warned her never to walk through their town again. Some versions of the story say they even damaged her car and tossed stones at her windows that night, trying to intimidate her into fleeing. She managed to escape and reach Harlem shaken, crying, and terrified for her safety. When she explained what happened, the story spread through the neighborhood in hours. What truly set Bumpy off wasn't just the harassment. It was the fact that she wasn't involved in any street business. She wasn't connected to any conflict. She was simply a hard-working woman trying to live her life, and they targeted her because of the color of her skin. For Bumpy Johnson, that crossed a line. He had always positioned himself as a protector of Harlem's people, especially those who couldn't defend themselves. And when he heard that the local sheriff dismissed her complaint and refused to take action, the message was clear: she would get no justice from the authorities. That's when Bumpy made a decision that shocked even his closest associates. He didn't call the police. He didn't send a messenger. He didn't negotiate. Instead, he stood up, put on his long coat, and said the words that would echo through Harlem for years. "If they want trouble, let's show them we don't scare easy." Within hours, the march was set into motion, one woman's cry for help becoming the catalyst for one of the boldest demonstrations of power Harlem had ever seen. When Bumpy Johnson made the decision to confront the hostile white town, he didn't have to shout, beg, or threaten anyone to join him. Word traveled fast in Harlem, faster than telephones, faster than newspapers. It spread through barbershops, pool halls, corner stores. hours clubs, and kitchens where people leaned out windows sharing the breaking news. Bumpy's moving out tonight. He's taking men with him. Everyone knew what it meant when Bumpy was moving with intention. This wasn't about money, territory, or business. This was about honor, protection, and community pride. Men who respected Bumpy and feared what could happen if Harlem looked weak began gathering without being asked. Some came carrying nothing but their fists. Others brought bats, chains, or whatever protection they could manage. By midnight, block outside Bumpy's apartment looked like a mobilization center. Cars lined up bumper to bumper. Men stood in groups of 5 or 6, whispering, checking over their shoulders and making sure everyone knew the plan. No recklessness, no panic, no turning back. What shocked many outsiders was how organized it all seemed. Bumpy wasn't some out-of-control gangster dragging frightened people behind him. He was a commander, rallying volunteers who trusted him with their lives. He walked through the crowd calmly, tapping shoulders, giving instructions without raising his voice. His lieutenants, men who had proven their loyalty over years, organized the groups into cars and formed a convoy. Some men joined because of loyalty. Some joined because they believed in protecting their own. And others joined simply because Bumpy had earned a reputation. When he stood up for someone, he didn't fail. By sunrise, nearly 100 men were ready, engines running, headlights cutting through the early morning fog. Harlem watched silently from windows and fire escapes as Bumpy climbed into the lead car. It wasn't just a march. It was a message that Harlem was not powerless, not unprotected, and not afraid to stand up when one of their own was threatened. And once those engines roared to life, there was no turning back. As Bumpy Johnson's convoy of nearly 100 men crossed the final stretch of road toward the hostile white town, the atmosphere shifted from calm to electric tension. This was a place where black people were expected to stay in their lane, a place where even driving through could trigger trouble. So when dozens of cars rolled in, slow, steady, and organized, windows opened, curtains twitched, people stepped out onto porches in disbelief. At first, the townspeople didn't understand what they were seeing. Some thought it was a funeral procession. Others suspected a gang convoy from the city. A few, realizing exactly who it might be, ran back inside to alert neighbors and grab hunting rifles that had been sitting on walls for generations. The local culture of intimidation was suddenly reversed. Instead of a lone black traveler being surrounded, it was the town itself facing an unexpected presence of power and unity. Phones started ringing, landlines buzzing through kitchens and living rooms, spreading alarm like wildfire. By the time the convoy reached the central road, small clusters of white men had begun to gather near storefronts and gas stations, watching silently, hands tucked into their jackets, eyes following every move. Some men shouted slurs from a distance, but none dared to step forward. The sight of so many black men arriving together, moving with discipline and without fear, disrupted the town's long-established hierarchy. The sheriff's office quickly noticed the commotion. Deputies jogged out to the street, confusion written across their faces. They weren't accustomed to situations they couldn't immediately control. One deputy stood frozen on the sidewalk, gripping his holster as if unsure whether to draw or wave them away. For the first time, the town understood something it had never experienced. Harlem wasn't coming to bow, it was coming to confront. And the most unsettling part for the locals was the silence. Bumpy's men weren't yelling, weren't threatening, weren't causing chaos. They simply arrived calm and coordinated, breaking every racist expectation the town held. That silence, cold, steady, and full of purpose, was louder than any threat could ever be. The town realized this was not a warning. This was a statement. When the convoy finally arrived at the center of town, the atmosphere snapped tight like a stretched wire. The sheriff, thick-shouldered man with a reputation for being quick, tempered, stepped out of his office, flanked by armed deputies. Their hands hovered near their belts, not quite gripping their guns, but not relaxed either. They expected chaos. They expected shouting. They expected Bumpy's men to rush forward like an angry mob. Instead, they found themselves facing a controlled formation. Bumpy's men stepped out of their cars in coordinated groups, doors opening and closing in unison. No one made sudden moves. No one shouted. The discipline alone rattled the sheriff. This wasn't the behavior of reckless criminals. This was organization, intent, strength with intelligence behind it. The sheriff approached the lead vehicle cautiously, trying to look confident but failing to hide the fear in his eyes. Behind him, townspeople watched from sidewalks and rooftops, whispering nervously, some clutching rifles but unsure whether to act. They had never faced a situation where they were outnumbered, maneuvered, and psychologically outpowered on their own streets. When Bumpy stepped forward, the murmurs grew louder. He didn't swagger or yell. He walked slowly, hands visible, chin raised, coat brushing against the gravel. He didn't need to prove authority. His presence alone commanded it. The sheriff raised his hand, signaling for Bumpy to stop a few feet away. The two men stared at each other in complete silence. For several seconds, the entire town felt frozen. Bumpy's men stood still behind him, like a wall. The deputies shifted nervously, not knowing whether to prepare for violence or hold back. One wrong move, one panicked reaction, and the street could have turned into a battlefield. Finally, the sheriff spoke first, voice rough and tense. "What's the meaning of all this?" Bumpy didn't blink. He didn't fold. He simply answered, "We're here because one of ours was threatened. And you did nothing." The sheriff swallowed hard. The public challenge in front of his own people weakened his authority instantly. But if he escalated, he risked a confrontation he couldn't win. If he backed down, the town would see that their traditional power didn't work today. He tried to regain control, barking orders for everyone to stay back, but his voice cracked slightly, a sign of fear that did not go unnoticed. His deputies exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unnerved. The balance of power in that moment shifted. This wasn't a mob versus the law. This was a leader versus a weak authority, and the entire town felt the shift, just when it seemed like the standoff was seconds away from erupting into violence. Something completely unexpected happened, something that no one on either side had predicted. As Bumpy and the sheriff stared each other down, a pickup truck came screeching around the corner and stopped right between the two groups. The driver jumped out, an older white man the town recognized instantly. He wasn't a deputy, he wasn't a politician. He was the owner of the factory where the young black woman worked before the attack, and the entire crowd went silent when they saw him standing there. This man wasn't known for being progressive or friendly toward black people. In fact, he was known for being strict, old-fashioned, and very protective of his reputation. But what stunned the town was what he admitted in front of everyone. He stepped toward the sheriff and said, loud enough for both sides to hear, "I warned you this would happen if you let those boys run wild." The sheriff froze. Deputies exchanged nervous looks. Townspeople stared in disbelief. The factory owner wasn't siding with Bumpy, but he wasn't siding with the sheriff either. He was publicly acknowledging that the harassment of the black woman had happened. He was confirming that he had reported it. He was admitting that the sheriff did nothing. This revelation shattered the sheriff's authority in an instant. The townspeople had always believed their lawman handled everything properly. But now someone they respected was saying the problem wasn't Bumpy's arrival. It was the sheriff's failure. Bumpy didn't have to say a word. The truth was spoken by someone from the other side, alone, shifted the energy of the entire confrontation. The sheriff's face turned red. His jaw tightened. He tried to interrupt, but the factory owner cut him off again. If you had done your job, these men wouldn't be here. The deputies grew visibly uneasy. Their leader had just been exposed in front of his own community. And for the first time, people in the crowd began questioning if the sheriff's toughness was just for show. The fear that once empowered him now boomeranged back toward him. Even more shocking, a few white townspeople, without being asked, lowered their rifles and stepped back, not out of sympathy, but because they realized this wasn't a gang invasion. It was a response to their own sheriff's negligence. The balance of power shifted dramatically. Bumpy's men were united. The sheriff's authority collapsed. The town stood confused, divided, and uncertain. Suddenly, Bumpy was no longer the outsider forcing his way in. He was the man standing on the side of truth, and the sheriff knew it. The entire town knew it. The moment changed everything. With the sheriff's authority collapsing and the town shocked by the factory owner's admission, Bumpy Johnson did something that nobody expected, especially not from a man with 100 loyal followers behind him. He didn't threaten, he didn't shout, and he didn't push for a fight. Instead, he took a slow step forward, hands open and visible, showing absolute control and discipline. His men didn't move an inch. The silence was so heavy that even the wind seemed to stop. Bumpy looked at the sheriff with a calm that felt more powerful than any weapon. He spoke in a low, steady voice, not trying to intimidate, making sure every word cut through the tension. We didn't come for trouble. We came for accountability. The sheriff tried to defend himself, sputtering excuses, but his voice sounded weak and desperate. Every attempt he made only made him look smaller. Bumpy didn't argue or try to embarrass him further. Instead, he laid out the situation in a way that left no room for confusion. He explained, slowly and clearly, the harassment of the black woman wouldn't be buried, ignored, or dismissed. He demanded 3 things: an immediate investigation into the attackers, protection for the woman if she returned, a guarantee that no harm would come to any black person passing through the town again. But what made the moment unforgettable wasn't the demands, it was the delivery. Bumpy didn't threaten violence if the demands weren't met. He didn't raise his voice or step into the sheriff's space. He simply stood his ground with a level of confidence that made everyone understand one thing. He was in control without ever having to act like a bully. The factory owner nodded in agreement, backing Bumpy's account and making it even harder for the sheriff to dodge responsibility. A wave of murmurs went through the crowd. Some townspeople were shocked to see a black man negotiating on equal footing. Others could see the sheriff folding under the pressure of truth. Then came the moment that changed everything. The sheriff, faced and shaken, lowered his eyes and muttered, "We'll look into it." It wasn't a strong promise. It was the first time in the town's history that the sheriff had been forced to publicly acknowledge wrongdoing against a black citizen. And the fact that he made the commitment in front of Bumpy's men and his own people took away his option to quietly bury the situation later. Bumpy didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply nodded once, turned around, and signaled his men to get back into the cars. The message was clear. He came for justice, not war. And by choosing negotiation over violence, he proved something far more powerful than dominance. He proved discipline, leadership, and intelligence that the town had never seen from a black leader before. In the days that followed Bumpy Johnson's bold march into the hostile white town, the entire region felt the shockwave of what had happened. Word spread quickly, not just through Harlem, but through surrounding towns that had long believed they could mistreat black residents without consequence. People talked about it in barber shops, church basements, diners, and union halls. The story grew, not because of violence, because violence didn't happen. For many black communities, the event became a symbol of something they rarely experienced in that era: collective strength. Seeing Bumpy stand firm, negotiate, and return safely with all his men created a new sense of confidence. People realized that they didn't always need to respond with fear. They needed unity, organization, and leadership. It wasn't about promoting conflict. It was about demanding dignity. In the white town, the atmosphere shifted too. The sheriff, once seen as an unbreakable figure of local authority, now had a crack in his reputation. He faced pressure not just from Bumpy's presence, but from his own townspeople who questioned why he allowed the situation to escalate in the first place. The factory owner's public criticism caused even more internal tension. Some residents felt embarrassed. Others felt angry that their tough town had been exposed as unprepared and disorganized when confronted by a united black force. The attackers who harassed the woman suddenly weren't as bold as before. They kept quiet, avoided attention, and some even disappeared from public view for weeks. Their confidence evaporated. They realized that their behavior wasn't invisible anymore, and that someone powerful was willing to confront them if they stepped out of line again. But the most significant change happened quietly, almost invisibly. Black travelers began to pass through the area with less fear. People who once avoided the town at all costs found themselves able to move through with a little more security. The racial boundaries, unspoken but heavily enforced, didn't disappear overnight, but they softened. The town's residents looked twice before acting aggressively. The sheriff watched his deputies more carefully, and the line that separated their territory from the rest of the world became less rigid. Bumpy's actions didn't end racism. They didn't dismantle segregation, but they interrupted it publicly, powerfully, and without bloodshed. In a time when violence against black people was often met with indifference, the fact that one man and his community stood up and forced accountability was monumental. Harlem talked about it for years. The white town never forgot it, and the story became part of Bumpy Johnson's legend, not because he fought, because he changed the rules simply by showing up, united, prepared, and unafraid. The 1949 March wasn't just another story in Bumpy Johnson's life. It became one of the defining moments that permanently shaped his reputation in Harlem. Before this event, Bumpy was already known as a strategist, a negotiator, and a man who protected his community from outsiders who tried to exploit or intimidate them. But after this event, he evolved from a respected figure into a symbol of resistance, leadership, and fearless unity. People in Harlem admired strength, but they admired smart strength even more. Bumpy didn't storm into the town like a reckless gangster looking for a fight. He marched in like a general leading a peaceful but powerful show of unity. He didn't resort to violence. even though he had the manpower to do so. Instead, he controlled the situation with intelligence, calm, and strategic negotiation. Ability to stand in the middle of hostile territory and resolve a crisis without bloodshed made him more legendary than any story of street power or intimidation ever could. What impressed the community the most was the discipline of his men. 100 individuals, all loyal, all coordinated, all trusting him with their safety. It showed Harlem that Bumpy wasn't just feared, he was respected, even loved by those who believed in him. Leadership like that isn't forced, it's earned over years of loyalty, fairness, and consistency. The story of the march became a reminder that Bumpy wasn't simply protecting his own interests. He was protecting anyone in Harlem who couldn't defend themselves. Generations later, elders in Harlem would retell the story not as a tale of violence, but as a tale of dignity. They spoke of how Bumpy walked into a racist town, not to fight, but to demand justice, something unheard of in that era. They spoke of how not a single man was harmed, not a single shot was fired, because Bumpy refused to let emotion override strategy. Restraint showed a level of leadership rarely seen in figures of that time. The white town never forgot that day either. For decades, locals whispered about the moment when a convoy of black men entered their streets and forced their sheriff to acknowledge wrongdoing. Even those who disliked Bumpy admitted privately that they respected his courage. He didn't come to conquer, he came to correct. And that difference is what made the event echo through history. In the long timeline of Bumpy Johnson's life, from Harlem politics to underworld alliances, this event stood out as a moment of pure leadership, a moment where he proved that strength doesn't always come from violence. Sometimes it comes from discipline, unity, and the courage to walk into danger without flinching. This is why the 1949 march became a cornerstone of Bumpy's legend. Not just because he showed power, but because he showed controlled, principled, and purposeful power. That's the version of Bumpy Harlem never stopped talking about.